Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Of the 4 essays that David Hume authored having to do with particular schools, or as he will call them, sects of philosophy, the shortest is the third one, the Platonist, which is subtitled, or the Man of Contemplation and Philosophical Devotion. And we need to remind ourselves that Hume is not here trying to give a faithful depiction of Plato or the later Platonists. And by the way, there were other people in Europe and England in particular who were, viewing themselves as Platonists at that time. But each of these essays represents a certain approach to life, you could say, that's broader than just that philosophical school, but which seems to have some traits, some features in common with it. So we can identify some characteristic Platonist doctrines in what he's putting forward, but we should understand it also in a broader sense. So he begins by talking about the variability of human beings and their views on what's really most important. And he starts out, to some philosophers, it appears a matter of surprise that all mankind possessing the same nature and being endowed with the same faculties should differ so widely in their pursuits and inclinations, and one should utterly condemn what is fondly sought after by another. To some, it appears even more surprising that a man should differ so widely from himself at different times, and after possession reject with disdain what before was the object of all his vows and wishes. And so Hume will talk about the feverish uncertainty and irresolution in human conduct, which is unavoidable. Now, the Platonist has a great explanation for why this should be the case, both why it is that different human beings, even though they have the same nature, have very different viewpoints, and how the same person can change their mind over not just the course of their entire life, but even the course of a day. He's going to give as an example possessing a pleasure, desiring it very strongly before you possess it, and then afterwards feeling a sense of disgust with that pleasure. That's a change in one's point of view. And so he's going to talk about the ways in which we typically go wrong. He says that, human minds will find themselves engaging in pursuit of popular pleasure and popular applause. They will get themselves screwed up by vice or folly, and when they can't get what they want, they become furious and enraged and spread horror and devastation on the neighboring plains, using this sort of metaphor of a river. And he says that human minds are actually smaller streams arising first from the boundless ocean of bliss and glory that is the divinity. So if we're focusing on the wrong things, which is what most human beings do, we are not going to grasp what it is that could give us genuine, consistent happiness. And that's why we fall into this uncertainty and irresolution. And so he tells us that people recommend their own pursuit and invite the credulous hearers to an imitation of their life and manners. And who does he actually have in mind? Well, the characters, we might say, of the previous two essays. So the first set of critiques are going to apply to the Epicurean, and the second are going to apply to the Stoic. And again, we're not talking about the actual schools as such, but human beings that have those sorts of mindsets. So he's going to begin by talking about the pleasures. He says that the heart belies the countenance and sensibly feels, even amid the highest success, the unsatisfactory nature of all those pleasures which detain the heart from its true object, which is divinity, God, the highest thing, the most valuable thing. And he says, I examine the, as he calls him, the voluptuous man, the pleasure seeker. I examine him at different stages. So before he actually gets his pleasure, he's very ardent in his desire. Oh, this is really going to be great. Then he enjoys his pleasure, right? And then he has enjoyed the pleasure, and he says the sense of his guilt and misery returns upon him with a double anguish, his mind tormented with fear and remorse, his body depressed with disgust and satiety. So the pursuit of pleasure is not going to be a successful way to attain happiness. Hume can, as the Platonist, dismiss that fairly quickly. And then he says, okay, what about a better kind of person? A more august, at least more haughty personage, assuming the title of a philosopher and man of morals, right? He challenges with a visible, though concealed impatience, our approbation and applause, and seems offended we should hesitate a moment before we break out into admiration of his virtue. So the Platonist, Hume, speaking as the Platonist, is saying, these Stoic types, really, they're all about, great character and virtue, but why are they interested in that? They're looking for glory. They're looking for other people to recognize this in them. And so he actually gets to talk a little bit, the Stoic, and says, before I can enter on this inquiry, he flings himself from me and addressing his discourse to that crowd of heedless auditors, abuses them, And Hume is going to say, as the Platonist, philosopher, your wisdom is vain and your virtue unprofitable. You are looking for other people to recognize you. The ignorant applauses of men, not the solid reflections of your own conscience, which would be better. Or, still better yet, the more solid approbation of that being who with one regard of his all-seeing eye penetrates the universe. He goes on and says, you're conscious of the hollowness of your pretended probity, calling yourself a citizen, a son, a friend. You forget the higher sovereign, your true father, the greatest benefactor. So, in other words, God, right? Where is the gratitude you owe to the Creator? You are confining yourself to human things, and instead you should be focusing on the divinity. So he goes on and says, you are your own idol, right? You're engaging in self-idolatry. You worship your imaginary perfections. Or, now here's a really interesting twist, right? So notice what he's going to say next. Sensible of your real imperfections, you seek to deceive the world and please your fancy by multiplying your ignorant admirers, right? So, what do we have here? Imaginary versus real, imaginary perfections, real imperfections. Sounds kind of Platonist, right? But you're not looking in the right direction. You're using fancies of the human mind, rather looking to what really is perfect. He says, not content with neglecting what is most excellent in the universe, you are trying to substitute in his place what is vile and contemptible, namely yourself. And then he's going to talk about human productions, let's call it. So he says, consider the works of men's hands, the invention of human wit. You will find the most perfect production proceeds from the most perfect thought. It's mind alone, which we admire while we bestow our applause on the graces of a well-proportioned statue or the symmetry of the noble pile. So the statuary of the architect comes into view and makes us reflect on the beauty of his art and contrivance, which they extracted from unformed matter. So they gave it shape through human labor and thought. Great, that's wonderful, right? There is some beauty there, but there's a greater beauty. This is what the Stoic was focusing on, the beauty of the human mind, intelligence. And he says the superior beauty of thought and intelligence you acknowledge, and you invite us to contemplate in your conduct harmony of affection, the dignity of sentiments, and those graces of mind which chiefly merit our attention. Now, those are good things too, right? So we're moving from the lower sort of bodily beauty to the beauty of the soul. If you have read the Symposium by Plato, you recognize this movement, don't you? And then he says, why are you stopping short? Don't you see anything beyond that that's valuable? Amid your rapturous applauses of beauty and order, are you ignorant where we can find the most consummate beauty, the most perfect order? And so we get a typical Platonist progression here. Compare the works of art with those of nature. The works of art are but imitations of the other. The better that art approaches to nature, the better the art is, the more beautiful it is. But nature is itself the production of something yet greater, which we can move from nature to contemplate. So he says, art copies only the outside of nature. Can we be so blind as to not discover an intelligence and design in the exquisite and stupendous contrivance of the universe? Can we be so stupid as not to feel the warmest raptures of beauty and adoration upon the contemplation of that intelligent being, so infinitely good and wise? And he says, listen, if you want the best happiness, well, then you have to ascend in your mind to the divine. He says the most perfect happiness would arise from the contemplation of the most perfect object. What is more perfect than beauty and virtue, right? So beauty, where? Not just in individual things, the beauty of the entire universe as a totality. What about virtue? I mean, we can find that in ourselves if we've cultivated virtue, but where we're really going to find it in its greatest degree, or we might even say not even in a degree, but in its original, is in the benevolence and justice of the deity, God and God's attributes. And he goes on and says, if anything can diminish the pleasure of this contemplation, it must be either the narrowness of our faculties or the shortness of our lives. But if we use the faculties that we have within the time that we have, we can actually participate in this. So what we've got here is a third point of view that is being put forward quite powerfully, quite succinctly as well, representing not just Platonism, but anything that would say that we need to direct ourselves to something much higher than ourselves and higher than the universe itself. So now, what we've seen here is each of these essays in turn is critically responding to the previous one and providing a more attractive alternative with some explanations. So the Platonist is, in some respects, surpassing the Epicurean and the Stoic.